I'm going to introduce Katie Condon.
The two waves of applause is something that brings me a lot of joy about this place. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Yay, great. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Leah, Adam, Gwen, and the fantastic writers on staff. My great gratitude to Camille and Nate and my fellow workshop poets. It's really such a privilege to be here, and I thank all of you for your brilliance and generosity. I'll read 4 poems today, and I'll start with one from my first book, Praying Naked, She's a Beauty. And the first line of this poem is also the title. On the 7th day, God says, what you've got is virgin charm and a knife in your pocket. And I'm like, thanks? The heart finds its anchor in the sky. The woman is told she is a tabernacle. On the 43rd day, I confuse my hangover for grief. God says, your longing will be for me, and I will dominate you. And I'm like, nope. The morning wears a cotton dress. Is this all I will amount to? The hot breath of months in my pocket, every telephone pole I mistook for a tree, the melancholy suspicion of library security? Nah. The bartender hums the tune of a hummingbird rising from its flower. I say, I inherited Sappho's pussy, and I believe me. God says, thou shalt not kill, and I'm like, but what about with my eyes? I never asked for the capacity to love ugly things, but here I am. Carnation, daisy, lavender lately, the lavender of late. I boil my stock exclusively with wishbones. I say, I like my men smooth and far away, reticent as a bookshelf. And God butts in, I could do that for you. His eyes search me like a pendulum. I've scraped a dead man's ashes out from under my fingernails like lice eggs. A woman raised in contest with other women is a child of God. God says, this is getting serious. And I'm like, you bet. I remember my ignorance and miss it. The skies open silently with a woman's legs. Morning glory, morning glory, morning, hallelujah. The rest of the poems that I'll read, and there are 3 more, are from my collection in progress called Before the Body. These poems are preoccupied with the joy and disorientation of pregnancy and new motherhood. It's concerned with the possible origins of consciousness and the limits of memory, small talk stuff. And I'm going to begin with a poem that represents what was for me, luckily, a period of intense joy and wonder. It's called 5-Star Yelp Review of Conceiving My Children. The overall vibe of the bedroom was so-so. Sweat-stained briefs on the ground, dirt on the headboard, but my husband lit some candles and the evening came through with a lovely breeze, so I was more than willing to look past the clutter. I think it even started raining during foreplay, and I mean, come on, that's some Notebook shit. But anyway, on to the thing everyone wants to know about, the orgasms. I'm sort of embarrassed, but I'm seriously wondering if those were actually my first ones ever. I mean, are all orgasms supposed to feel like the galaxy is opening its wide eyes to look right through you, and suddenly you realize that all you are is a piece of dust ejected from the nose of a throbbing star? But at the same time, you feel expansive, infinite, like you are the galaxy, and your wide eyes just keep getting wider and wider and wider until you're incomprehensible as Nietzsche in German when you can't read German, or Gertrude Stein in any language at all. To be honest, it was just so crazy. Like, when pleasure isn't an end in itself, it's like you're playing God. It's like you've always been God, you just didn't know, but now you do, and so you just fuck into life a new suffering, a new and joyous bundle of suffering. When it was all over, we went outside into the evening's moving air and felt like we'd made that too. The wind, I mean, and the dragonflies asleep wherever they sleep, and also the big quiet that comes with darkness. As some of you know, when you're pregnant, you get to create a personalized birth plan to share with your nurses and your midwives, like, I want an epidural, or I don't want an epidural, or I want to have a water birth with the lights dimmed and a beach house song playing. Like, my birth plan was that specific. But delivering my kids, I learned two things. The first thing I learned is that my body and my kid's body could give a hoot about my birth plan. And the second thing that I learned was what real, actual danger we were in. This poem is called When I Gave Birth, I Expected a Baby. When I gave birth, I expected a baby, but I got a prisoner of war and disposable underwear. I expected a baby, but I got a complimentary chef-prepared celebratory dinner for two and a $35,000 bill. Before I gave birth, I was suspicious that not a baby, but an entire winter would rush forth, what with the tumult of weather into which my body was forced. When I gave birth, I expected a baby, but became a wound, desecrated, an animal. I was handed the screaming Baltic Sea. I expected a baby, but was presented with a public figure and a conjoined pair of ceramic shoes that said, "Blessed." When I gave birth, I was shown to a cot in the wing teeming with the apocalyptic gossip of machines. I was handed a mess of wires and an accelerated course on how to subpoena breath. When I gave birth, I longed for a baby, but was given lilacs, plastic ones, because that kind never dies. This is my last poem. Thank you all so much again for being here. There are so many incredible readings, and I feel really glad that you came here. I was told to put the water underneath after I took a sip so no one else got it. Okay, thank you. It was my job not to think of her. It was my job not to think of her when I sat in the front row of her husband's poetry class. It was my job not to think of her when he read us to the harbor master, but mostly looked at me. It was my job not to think of her when I idled on a gravestone beside her husband, who, with 2 fingers, lifted my chin to the crusts of his lips. By him, by my own willful youth, I was granted 2 duties: to be beautiful and not to think of her. It was my duty not to think of her even when he spoke of her. It was my job not to think of their daughter, just 1 month old. It was my sworn vocation, I'm telling you, not to give her access to her husband or my mind, to exile her to the void of mere memory. It was my job not to think of her, but I thought of her every time her husband entered a room, entered me, every time he entered the clearing from the woods, entered the back seat from the parking lot, every time he entered the shower, I thought of her, of how her body received him, her heart, whether her heart, if given the chance, would receive him again. Would her body? It was my job, it was my job, it was my job not to think of her. But here I am again thinking of her long after I saw her husband finally for what he was. The kind of poet who actually believes the spirits of the dead ventriloquize the sparrows, that it was the sparrows who led him through song and beak to the vile abandon of his family. When I see sparrows, I think not of him, but of her. Even now, not a bird in sight, she is roosted in the overrun woods of my mind as she has been every day since my son was born. Every mule, every coo, every midnight brawl with the nursing bra, I think of her. I look at my son and I think of her soothing her daughter, the the two of them alone in the harrowing newness of life, and I think how I thought she deserved it. I think how I thought motherhood was an appropriate punishment for someone who could make that poor little man so sad. Some days I allow myself to think she'll forgive me the way only a mother can forgive a child. And wasn't I then as much a child as I was a woman sleeping with someone else's husband on whatever trail or back seat or borrowed bed I could manage? I think of how boorishly happy I was then at the thought of her loneliness. I think of how hard I was bent over by guilt. I idle at the edge of my happiness now, watching my children clamber into bed to wake up my husband, all of us in the arms of the same room, and I think of her. Thank you so much. Please keep your applause going for Lars Horn.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, no? Yeah, good, okay. Thank you to everyone who makes this possible. You're a wonderful team and deeply appreciated. It's magic to be here. So I'm going to read a very abridged essay from my book, Voice of the Fish, because my wife told me to. I was like, I'm going to read this other thing. She went, no. And this is how we roll. So, what manner of land? Each December in Sicily's Syracuse, 60 men in green berets carry a simulacrum of Santa Lucia through the streets. Over 12 feet tall and sculpted from 200 pounds of silver, the martyr towers above the crowds. A dagger pierces her neck. A reliquary glitters in her chest. One arm cradles a palm leaf, whilst the other extends a dish from which flames leap as the saint's severed eyeballs survey the townsfolk. Venerated across Italy and Scandinavia, Santa Lucia, or Saint Lucy, is one of Christianity's oldest martyrs, perishing in 304 AD. During the Diocletian persecution. Lucia's father, born to Syracusan nobility, died in her early years, leaving Lucia to the care of her widowed and ailing mother. In adulthood, Lucia, a devout believer, took her mother Eutychia to St. Agatha's tomb, a pilgrimage that not only cured Eutychia of a bleeding disease, but convinced her to distribute the family's wealth, as Lucia had long wished. Learning that Lucia was bestowing the family's heritage and jewels upon the poor, her betrothed announced her face to Paschasius, governor of Syracuse. Paschasius ordered Lucia to burn a sacrifice before his image. When she refused, he sentenced her to defilement in a brothel. And so it came to pass. Paschasius' guards went to escort Lucia from the governor's chambers and floundered. Lucia stood impossibly, divinely fast. The guards yoked a team of oxen to Lucia, but still the martyr could not be dragged. They heaped wood at her feet, set torches to dry logs, but the flame refused to take. Instead, Lucia addressed the governor, prophesied, "You will be punished, Paschasius. The Diocletian rule shall fall. Maximian's end calls." At this, Paschasius had Lucia's eyes gouged from their sockets and a sword thrust through her neck. Blinded, silenced, Lucia died. Other legends maintain that Lucia tore out her own eyes, sending them as a deterrent to an unwanted admirer. Pre-Tinder, wild world. In both cases, Lucia's eyes are said to have been miraculously restored upon burial. The patron saint of Syracuse and Perugia, Italy, Lucia's patronage extends to martyrs, virgins, authors, cutlers, glaziers, saddlers, stained glass workers, and even salesmen. But above all, Santa Lucia is the patron saint of sight, the blind, and is invoked against ocular diseases. In iconographic representations, Lucia's eyes blink from salvers, swivel within the saint's own palms. In a painting by Francesco del Cosa, they bud from a tree branch. Presiding over sight and blindness, light and darkness, Santa Lucia is traditionally celebrated in the frost-bitten, dead hours of the winter solstice, hours when she rises, guardian of Earth's longest, darkest night. Royal Leamington Spa, UK, 6:30 a.m., winter solstice 2013. Locking the door to my mother's house, I walked the 10 minutes to the local swimming pool. The night still lingered, metallic, biting, mist curled off the river, silver quickly followed by darkness. I pulled my Reebok windbreaker further up my face, pushed up the bank, and turned onto the gravel footpath. Some way off, beyond the trees, beyond the steep bank that saw walkers slide, almost fall into the churn, the river twisted between fields, glittering blocks of flats. As I watched the mist spiral above the tree line, I heard the crunch of trainers over gravel. In front of me, a man approached. White, 6 feet tall, light grey tracksuit, scarf wound about his mouth and nose. My breath caught. Get a grip, Lars. It's just a man out walking. I cleared my throat. Gone. Over. He kept walking. So did I. Street lamps pooled, splashed off the curb. Now and then the light poured across a car windscreen, rushed off the bodywork. Early that midwinter morning, I was minutes from reaching the pool, minutes from my day, months, years of my life, carrying on uninterrupted, when the man I'd passed decided I was the person he wanted to abduct. This man who jogged back, whom I heard before I felt, soft footfall, shadow, strange movement, this man who under the smoldering orange of a street lamp wrenched me back by the mouth. In 2014, scientists at Surrey Nanosystems revolutionized black pigment when they created Vantablack, a black fabricated by growing cultures of carbon nanotubes on aluminium foil. The resulting surface absorbed 99.96% of visible light, flattening all forms it covered. In 2019, MIT scientists Brian Wardle and Kehang Kui unveiled a new blackest black, this time absorbing 99.995% of all light. When questioned about his team's discovery and the global search to create an ever blacker black, Wardle, professor of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT, simply remarked, "The blackest black is a constantly moving target. Someone will find a blacker material and eventually will understand all the underlying mechanisms and will be able to properly engineer the ultimate black." I remember the leather of his glove, cold, blunt force, blood. His hands clenched my teeth, tongue, throat, yanked my windbreaker until I choked, and our bodies, all the while our bodies bathed in lamplight, amber, liquid in the carbon night. I remember that I screamed, that even then I didn't recognize the sound as coming from my own mouth, how it tore my lungs, my whole chest, more chemical blister than breath. The man dragged me into a thicket, though I do not remember being dragged. I simply remember coming to, my body no longer on the path, the unevenness of earth, grass. I'm going to die. The world empty, inky, vacuous. Maybe he'll just rape me. If he just rapes me, that'll be okay. The world empty, save a deer, ochre bolt, disturbed before sunrise. And the constellations, gateways in some eternal night. Now, when I look out at the night, it appears denser, darker than it did before. In places, my vision blurs between the real and the imagined. I might be walking home, glancing from a window across the backyards, but the night looms unnatural, In places, I swear it swallows itself. I've grown used to it, slowly, across the years, this darkness that could hold a minotaur. And I know logically, in this era of microwaves and MRI scans, of probes, keyhole surgery, and satellites, that this is some echo of a traumatic event, some old weight that presses upon my eyes. But in that small time before sleep, as the night stains its way over this ancient sky, I let my thoughts drift, consider if there might be some arrogance to dismissing previous ways of seeing. Where did they go, all the gods and the beasts, the jackals and winged horses, sphinxes and fish, all those creatures that weighed our organs in the afterlife, fed on years ill-lived? What do they tow now, those creatures that carried the sun and the stars, drew the moon to its place in the firmament each night? In those hours, I consider whether this world really is lined in shadow, thin veil between spheres, whether when our bodies plunge, drag against and fray the weave, a kind of night bleeds, dense, resinous, vast beyond means. Maybe it is in these moments when we almost cross over, when we believe we see the other side, that we blur the boundary between the living and the dead, that we bring a supernatural darkness back with us through the gauze. Stemming from the Latin lux, or light, Santa Lucia comes as beacon in name as well as martyrdom. Lucia is often conceptualized as a bringer of light, her significance understood somewhat simplistically as that of luminous salvation, a saint to banish the darkness, terrestrial and metaphysical alike. But in northern Italy, tradition dictates that each December, on the eve of her feast day, Lucia leaves children gifts as they sleep. In anticipation, offerings of food crowd side tables and doorsteps, coffee for Lucia, bread for Castaldo, her escort, and a fistful of flour for her donkey. Don't forget the donkey. But the event comes with one condition. No child may see Santa Lucia, for if they do, the saint will throw ashes in their eyes, blinding them for the night. According to this belief, Santa Lucia appears as a figure who deprives sight, who might bestow darkness as much as alleviate it. No longer conceived in simple opposition to darkness and suffering, Lucia possesses a more complex, even tangled relationship to both. Her faith confirmed in violence, her martyrdom baptized by blinding. Santa Lucia is a light born of darkness as much as a light to banish it. She understands long nights and their disturbing gifts, how they bestow ways of seeing, sights that cannot be unseen, how from darkness strange beasts come lumbering, fanged, shaggy, matted, how they pant from one's mouth, how they bite. Thank you very much.
And next we have Laura Spence-Ash.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Suwani, for always having such a wonderful and inviting conference. I was here 2 years ago, and 5 days before I got here, my book was sold, my debut book. So it feels like a wonderful full circle moment to be back here with this book in hand. The novel is the story of two families whose lives become intertwined when the daughter of a British family is sent to live with an American family during the Blitz. She lives with them for 5 years and then returns to London, and the novel follows both families for over 30 years as their lives come together and move apart. It is told in 8 points of view, one for each member of the two families. I'm going to read a few of the points of view from early in the novel. Reginald. That night, Reginald tells the fellows in the local pub how proud he is. He recounts the story of Beatrix leaving to everyone who comes in, telling the story again and again. They ask questions. They want to know the details. The ones whose children left before know this story, or a version of this story already. How the morning was hot and sticky. How they stood in the ballroom at the Grosvenor Hotel, and how he knelt on one knee when it had been time to go. How Beatrix had nodded at his last words, her face tilted to his, her chest held high. How she had been resolute and hadn't cried, even though he could see the tears forming. But a day later, he cannot quite remember what he said to her while he was kneeling on the floor. He worries, privately, that he forgot to say what was most important. But he tells everyone in the pub that night what a trooper she'd been, my brave 11-year-old girl. He makes up the words that they said to each other. And he doesn't explain that while he and Millie held it together for as long as possible, they turned away from Beatrix and moved through the crowds before he was truly ready to do so. He doesn't imagine that he would ever be ready to leave. In the dream he has again and again, he walks into the ocean, fully dressed, the wet fabric await. He pushes the waves aside as he goes deeper and finds himself back in that ballroom, leaving as others are arriving, his shoulders brushing against them, trying not to stare at the faces of the incoming parents, knowing that his eyes must mirror theirs, shocked to find themselves in this place, having made this decision to send their children far away, alone across the sea. Only outside, on the street by the hotel, the air thick, the gray clouds pushing down, did Millie begin to cry, pleading with him to go back and get their girl. He'd held her hand and pulled her away. In the dream, he holds out his hands, reaching, wishing he could pick up the ship she's now on and turn it around, wishing he could reverse its course. He extends his arms again, trying to touch the land where she will now live. But the story that he tells the boys is only half the truth. Beatrix was crying, holding on to him, her arms wrapped around his waist. She blamed Millie for sending her away, and she refused to say goodbye to her, was angry with her for the 24 hours between the time they told her and the moment she left. Reginald, in fact, was the one to insist she leave, knowing that the bombs were coming closer and closer, that there was no possible way to keep her or any of them safe. His older brother fought in the last war, and so he knew what was coming. That war cast a long shadow over his childhood. He and Millie were faced with an impossible choice. Better that she go to America, he thought, where the fingers of war were less likely to touch her. But he never told her that he'd forced Millie's hand. He let her believe it was Millie's choice. Millie. Millie can't rid herself of the fury. There was Beatrix's anger at her for forcing her to go, and Millie's own at Reg for not wavering when she pleaded. "Let me go with her," she said. And then later, in the middle of the night, neither of them sleeping nor touching, staring up at the dark ceiling, "Let's just keep her here. We've got the shelter and the underground. We can go to my parents in the country. I can keep her safe," she whispered again and again. "I will keep her safe." But Reg's mind was made up. She can't imagine a time when she will ever forgive Reg. She knows she will never forgive herself. Over and over, she revisits the ballroom, the final moments, the warmth of her daughter's cheek. She pinned the label the man handed her onto Beatrix's chest. It was a hot day, but Millie's hands were icy cold, and so she rubbed them together again and again before tucking one inside the top of Beatrix's dress to guide the pin in and out. The label had a long number on it, in addition to the name, and Millie memorized the number, thinking she would need to know it forever. She thought it might be the only way she could locate her girl. On the way home from the ballroom, she became frantic when she could no longer be sure whether the final number was a 3 or a 6. The night before, Millie had washed and cut Beatrix's hair in the small kitchen, a towel underfoot. Beatrix was in her underwear. Millie brushed the wet hair out before cutting, marveling that the thick strands almost reached Beatrix's waist. It was then, when Millie turned Beatrix around to comb out the front, that she realized that her breasts were beginning to bud, and that when she saw her again, she would have changed. She would no longer be a girl. And there was that fury again, but it was in her hands now, so without thinking, she chopped off her daughter's hair, cutting it just below the chin, locks of hair falling to the floor, the scissors slicing, the white towel turning brown, Beatrix crying. She cut the thick, dark bangs in a severe line across the middle of her forehead. It was the haircut she had given her every 3 weeks when she was a little girl. Now she can no longer sleep. She lies in Beatrix's bed, curling her body into a ball. She tries to imagine where her girl is in the middle of the Atlantic. Is she hungry? Is she alone? How frightened she must be by the deep water that wraps itself around the ship, the rocking waves, that vast sea. Millie smells a curl of the hair, tucked into a small envelope, hidden in the middle of her book. Beatrix. On the dock in Boston, Beatrix is alone. Everyone else has been picked up. It is already hot, even though it's early in the day, the moon etched in chalk on the pale blue sky. Beatrix is wearing her favorite dress, red wool with a white collar and piping at the cuffs. She picked it out carefully, remembering that her mother told her to look her best, but it is the wrong dress for the day, and sweat drips down her neck and back. The woman who paired up the other children with their host families keeps checking her watch and looking at her clipboard. The Gregorys, she says again and again, her voice getting sharper each time. That's the family name, is that right? Beatrix nods. The sun moves higher, tucks behind a cloud, and Beatrix shifts her weight from one foot to the other. She touches the label that she has repinned every morning since she left London. The edges are beginning to fray. Beatrix feels as though she left home years ago, as though the girl she was there is separate from the girl standing here. So much has transpired, although it has only been 2 weeks, and yet it seems like something out of a book, like it all must have happened to someone else. Docking in Canada and saying goodbye to most of her new friends. Another train and then a small ferry rolling through the rough waves. Finally, calm water as they entered Boston Harbor. On a small island, 3 barefoot children on a dock, holding fishing rods, waving as the ferry passed. Welcome to America, Beatrix thought. She looks down, making sure that her suitcase and gas mask are still at her side, and when she looks up, a boy is standing in front of her. It is almost as though she willed him to exist. He's taller than she is, with curly blonde hair so long it's practically at his collar. He raises his arm to block the sun out of his eyes with his hand. This is William, she thinks she knows. They'd had a letter describing the house and the family, and Beatrix read it every night on the ship. She memorized sections. Gerald is the younger boy, just turned 9, and William is 13. He's too smart for his own good, Mrs. Gregory wrote. Wants to be a baseball player when he grows up. Beatrix thought he'd have brown hair. She didn't think he'd be so tall or his eyes would be green. But still, this must be him. Beatrix, he says, and his voice is lower than she anticipated. He is almost smiling. She nods, and then another boy runs up, his face flushed, his crooked smile wide, his red gold hair shining in the sun. This is most certainly Gerald. You're Beatrix, aren't you, he says. You must be, I just know it. Yes, she says, smiling at last, because his accent is funny and his freckles are everywhere, and he's a wide-open American boy. Thank you, and thank you much for coming today.